What would you do if you heard tiny cries breaking through the morning fog, and when you followed the sound, you found them? Two German Shepherd puppies, tied to a rusted pier, left to die by the rising tide. Would you walk away, pretend you never saw them? Or would you risk everything, even your broken past, to save what the world tried to throw away? The city of Eldermere woke slow and shivering under a heavy blanket of sea fog. Nestled between weather-worn cliffs and a restless Atlantic coastline, the old port town looked like it had been abandoned by time itself. The streets were slick with dew, and the wind carried the metallic tang of salt and rust. March had come late to Eldermere this year, dragging with it the scent of old storms and secrets better left buried. At the edge of town, where the harbor once bustled with the cries of fishmongers and the clang of chains, the boneyard pier stretched out like the broken spine of some sea monster. Locals called it cursed. The wood was splintered, the railings long gone, and underneath the water slapped slow and cold against forgotten pilings. No ships docked here anymore, only ghosts. Frank Halloway moved like a shadow through the fog, his boots whispering across warped boards. In his early 60s, Frank was a tall man, though the years had pulled his shoulders into a quiet slope. He wore a faded navy peacoat, too big now for his thinned frame, and a wool cap pulled low over gray-streaked hair. His hands were rough and nicked, once steady with knots and sails, now stiff with arthritis. Frank had once served in the Navy, most of his life lived out at sea. But storms didn't only come from the sky. A tragedy more cruel than weather had taken his son Daniel 10 years ago. Since then, Frank had chosen silence over company, routine over conversation. He lived alone in a garage near the shipyard, spending his days painting ships he would never board again. No one asked questions. He didn't offer answers. This morning was like every other, until it wasn't. As Frank reached the far end of the pier, a sound broke through the hush. It was soft, fragile, a whimper. He paused, frowning, eyes scanning the shifting fog. Seagulls cried in the distance, but this was no bird. Another whimper, higher now, urgent. Not one, but two. Frank's heart skipped, his boots growing heavy as he moved toward the sound. He passed rusted mooring cleats and the skeletons of old crab traps until he saw a shape, dark, hunched, against one of the posts near the edge. Then he saw them, two puppies, barely a month old, both German shepherds. Their small bodies were tied together with a length of frayed rope that looped over a corroded metal post. Their back legs touched the planks, but their front paws dangled mid-air, straining. The larger of the two kicked weakly. The smaller was motionless, save for a trembling breath. Frank froze. He'd seen death before. He'd seen bodies overboard, animals lost at sea, suffering without voice. But this was cruelty, intentional. The rope had been pulled tight, just enough to prolong agony, not end it. He knelt down slowly, not wanting to startle them. His coat creaked at the seams as he crouched, breath catching in his throat. The wind shifted, and the smell hit him. Blood, urine, salt. The smaller pup had a gash across its brow. Dried blood had matted one side of its tiny face. The other had something wrong with its leg, bent at an odd angle. Frank reached out with one calloused hand, stopping just short of touching them. Their eyes met his. Even through the fog, even through the pain, there was a glint. Recognition, maybe, or desperate hope. That look hit him harder than the ocean ever had. He spoke, voice hoarse from disuse. "Who did this to you?" Neither pup answered, but the larger gave a faint whine and tilted its head, the way Daniel's old dog used to when he heard his name. Frank felt something sharp twist in his chest. He should go, call animal control, tell someone. But he didn't move. Instead, he just knelt there, the mist curling around him like memory. The puppies trembled in the silence. One more gust of wind, and the smaller might stop breathing altogether. He looked back down the pier. No one. Eldermere was still asleep. The world was still pretending not to hear. Frank pulled out his pocket knife. The blade clicked open with a familiar sound, one that had once meant utility, now hesitation. He could cut the rope, take them, do something. But his knees stayed grounded. Then, footsteps behind him. He turned sharply. No one. Just the creak of the pier and the echo of his own guilt. He stared at the puppies again. They were waiting. Frank Holloway stood motionless on the pier, the fog swirling around his boots like cautious fingers. The two German Shepherd puppies whimpered softly beside him, their tiny bodies trembling with a cold that cut deeper than mere weather. For a long moment, he stared down at them, heart pounding with a sensation he hadn't felt in years. A pull, a responsibility, a sting of old, stubborn grief. He exhaled sharp and cold. "All right," he muttered, as if to himself. "Let's get you off this damn dock." With trembling hands, he pulled the pocket knife from his coat again, its blade dulled by age but still functional. Carefully, he cut the rope holding the pups to the rusted post. The larger one slumped against his leg, unable to stand, while the smaller gave no resistance at all. He wrapped them both gently in the inside flap of his coat, their frail forms pressing close to the warmth of his chest. The walk home was slow, and he winced with each step, not from the weight, but from the memory it stirred. The garage stood where the city gave up, at the edge of Eldermere's shipyard district, where salt corroded the signs and the weeds had declared victory. Frank's home had once belonged to a mechanic named Earl, who died in a hurricane over a decade ago. The building had a single room with a bed, a sink, and walls covered in yellowing maps of the Atlantic. Against the far wall stood an old wooden workbench, and, beneath it, the rusted toolbox Earl had left behind. Frank never used it. He didn't fix things anymore. He pushed the garage door open with a grunt. The hinges protested with a high-pitched screech, waking the silence inside. He stepped in, flicked the light, and hesitated. This was not a place for the living. Yet, here he was, carrying life in both arms. He laid the puppies on an old wool coat by the heater and quickly turned the dial. The unit clicked a few times before coughing into a low hum. Frank crouched beside them, breath shallow. The larger pup stirred first, blinking blearily. Its fur was a muddled mix of tan and black, ears still too floppy to stand, and one paw hung at an odd angle, possibly fractured. The smaller one, much thinner, face still caked with dried blood, didn't open its eyes. Frank's fingers trembled as he dipped a rag in warm water and began cleaning the wound on the smaller pup's head. The dried blood flaked off slowly, revealing a swollen bruise just above the brow. "Still breathing," he murmured. "That's something." He worked silently for a long time. The heater whispered. The pups made soft sounds in their sleep. Outside, the fog pressed against the garage door like a secret trying to get in. Frank sat back on his heels and stared at them. His mind drifted unbidden to a different night. 10 years ago, a call. A Coast Guard radio squelching. Lost contact, capsized, no survivors confirmed. That was the night Daniel died. His son had begged him to let him take the old boat out during a spring storm. Just to the inlet, he'd said. Frank had refused. But Daniel took the keys while he slept. When Frank woke, the boat was gone. Hours later, so was Daniel. Frank had never sailed again, never opened the toolbox, never let anyone in, until now. A sharp knock on the garage door snapped him out of the memory. He tensed instinctively, standing fast and stepping in front of the puppies. Another knock, firmer this time. "Mr. Holloway," a young voice called. "You okay in there? I saw you coming back from the pier." Frank opened the door just enough to see a girl standing on the sidewalk. She looked about 17, with dark curls pulled into a messy bun and a blue denim jacket several sizes too large. Her name came to him slowly. Mira Ortega. She lived in the duplex across the alley. Her mother was a nurse, her father long gone. Mira was known for biking around Eldermere with a satchel full of books and bandages, helping stray cats and old neighbors with scraped knees. She had sharp eyes and a blunt voice, too grown for her age, but not unkind. "Is everything all right?" she asked, peering past him. Frank stepped outside and pulled the door nearly shut behind him. "I'm fine," he said flatly. Mira raised an eyebrow. "You've got blood on your coat." Frank looked down. So he did. "It's not mine." "Is it an animal?" Her tone shifted from curious to concerned. "Because if it's a cat or dog, my mom has vet friends. I could—" "No," he cut her off. "I've got it handled." She didn't press further, but her eyes narrowed slightly, catching the faint whimpering sound from inside the garage. "Just, if you need help," she said slowly, "you shouldn't be the only one who knows." She turned and walked away, her sneakers crunching softly on gravel. Frank closed the door behind him and leaned against it. heart pounding harder than it should. He glanced back at the puppies. Still breathing, still alive. Something had changed. Later that night, he rummaged through a cabinet for canned tuna, the only protein he had. He mushed it carefully and offered it to the larger pup, who licked at it weakly. The smaller one stirred once, but did not eat. Frank watched them until his eyelids grew heavy. Before heading to bed, he bent down and gently touched the smaller pup's ear. "You're not dying tonight," he whispered. And for the first time in a decade, he believed it. The next morning arrived slowly, as if Eldermere itself were reluctant to wake. A thin drizzle tapped against the garage roof, and the scent of wet asphalt drifted in through the cracked window. Inside, the heater still hummed weakly, but the air carried a bite. Frank sat hunched in his threadbare armchair, one eye on the old wall clock, the other on the two puppies curled up together under the thick wool coat. The larger pup, Cole, he had decided, was more alert today, his ears twitching whenever Frank moved. Ash, the smaller one, still hadn't opened his eyes since the night before. His breathing was shallow, uneven, but steady enough to keep Frank from panicking. Barely. Frank stood, his knees crackling with the effort. He fetched another towel from the closet, warming it in front of the heater before gently laying it over the pups. The tuna was gone. There was no more food suitable for dogs. He'd have to find something today. He didn't notice the sound of tires crunching gravel until the knock came. 3 quick raps on the side door. Frank stiffened. Few people ever knocked. Fewer still did it that early. The door creaked open before he could reach it. "You shouldn't leave it unlocked," said a voice, young, female, and entirely too familiar. Mira Ortega pushed her way inside without waiting for permission. She wore the same oversized denim jacket, a purple scarf wrapped twice around her neck, and fingerless gloves she had clearly knit herself. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her black curls were still damp from the mist. Behind her, her bicycle leaned precariously against the wall, one pedal squeaking like a rusty hinge every time the wind nudged it. Frank frowned. "I didn't ask for company." She ignored him. "I brought this." She held up a plastic bag, dog biscuits, gauze pads, antiseptic, and a small bottle of amoxicillin. "My mom's a nurse," she explained, walking past him. "She keeps extras. I told her I saw a hurt stray." Frank shut the door. "You told her about the dogs?" "No," she said, kneeling beside the pups. "I told her I saw something with a limp," which wasn't a lie. Frank watched her closely. Mira's eyes were bright but focused, and there was a kind of quiet authority in the way she moved, like she'd had to learn responsibility too soon. She reached out, brushing a strand of fur from Ash's closed eyelid. "This one's worse off," she murmured. "I know. He needs more than tuna and a space heater. I know that too." Mira didn't ask why Frank hadn't gone to a vet. She looked around the garage, the paint-chipped cabinets, the silent radio, the cluttered corners where memories went to rot, and seemed to understand. "How long you had them?" she asked. "Since yesterday morning. You named them yet?" He hesitated. "The little one's Ash, the bigger one's Cole." She smiled faintly. "Fitting." Frank shifted his weight, uncomfortable under her gaze. "What do you want?" "I want to help," she said simply. "Why?" Mira shrugged. "Because someone hurt them and you didn't walk away." That silenced him. She pulled out the gauze and carefully cleaned the scab on Ash's head. "When I was 10, she said softly, "a guy in our building poisoned a stray cat that used to follow me. Said it was dirtying his doorstep. Mom didn't report him. She said people like that never get punished in places like this." Frank watched her hands work, steady, deliberate. "She's not wrong. I swore I'd never let that happen again." A pause. The heater kicked into a higher setting. Mira glanced up. "You live alone?" Frank nodded. "Don't like people?" "Most days, no." "Good," she said. "They talk too much anyway." He almost smiled. Almost. She looked back at the pups. "They're not just abandoned, you know. Someone meant to kill them. That kind of rope, the placement, it's not random." Frank had considered that too, but hearing it aloud felt different, heavier. "You think it was kids?" he asked. "Maybe. Or someone trying to send a message." "To who?" She looked up, her expression sharper now. "Maybe to you." Frank turned away, walking over to the workbench. He didn't respond. Mira stood. "I can come back tomorrow, with real dog food, maybe some antibiotic cream. You shouldn't get involved. I already am." She slung the bag over her shoulder and headed for the door. "Oh, and I'd get that leg looked at," she added, nodding at Cole. "He's limping worse now. Might be broken." As she left, the bike let out a long, dramatic squeak that echoed in the cold. Frank stood alone again, his garage feeling a little less silent than before. That night, as rain began to patter against the roof, Frank sat beside the pups with a flashlight and the rusted old toolbox he hadn't opened in years. Inside was a stethoscope, a sewing kit, a faded photograph of Daniel holding a German Shepherd pup, and a blood pressure cuff long past its prime. He didn't know what made him do it. Maybe Mira's words. Maybe the photo. Maybe the way Ash's tiny chest rose and fell, as if daring the world to let him live. He took the picture and pinned it to the wall above the heater. The boy in the photo looked just like Daniel had before the sea took him. Eager, foolish, full of love. The puppy in his arms wasn't Ash, wasn't Cole, but something about the moment, the warmth of it, mattered now. Frank leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened to the rain. The rain lingered through the night, tapping a slow rhythm on the tin roof of Frank's garage. It was the kind of steady downpour that didn't demand attention, but filled every silence with a presence of its own. The heater clicked, then hissed, fighting back the chill. Frank lay in his armchair, a threadbare blanket over his legs, the pups barely a few feet away on their makeshift bedding of towels and coats. Ash was still weak, but the swelling around his eye had gone down slightly. Cole had managed a few wobbly steps earlier that morning, circling once before curling up protectively around his sibling, a quiet sentinel with half-lowered ears. Frank hadn't touched them since bringing them in. Not truly. He had cleaned, wrapped, fed, but there had always been a layer of distance, a hesitation born not from fear of the pups, but from something far older, a fear of the softness they might awaken. He sat forward now, hands resting on his knees, eyes locked on the rise and fall of Ash's chest. For a long time he watched, thought, remembered. 10 years could pass like dust on wood. 10 years since Daniel had laughed, splashed him with seawater, and begged to take the boat alone. 10 years since Frank had said no, then fallen asleep, too tired from a night shift at the docks. 10 years since he'd woken to find the keys gone. He had run down to the harbor barefoot. The boat was found, broken against the rocks. Daniel was not. A dog had waited at the pier all that night. A German Shepherd named Rex, loyal to a fault, eyes fixed on the sea. When the search was called off, it was Rex who refused to leave. Frank had buried the collar in the backyard, next to Daniel's empty marker. He hadn't touched another dog since. But now, here in this garage of forgotten tools and damp wood, lay two fragile lives that had nothing to do with his past and everything to do with the man he still was. Frank exhaled and moved slowly toward them. His hand hovered above Cole's back, rough fingers trembling slightly. The pup opened one eye, sniffed, and didn't flinch. Frank pressed his palm gently into the wet fur. It was coarse, sticky in places, matted with old blood and rain, but warm, alive. Cole shifted slightly under the touch, then leaned in. Frank's chest tightened. He moved to Ash next, brushing a knuckle along the uninjured side of the little pup's face. The touch was lighter than breath. Ash stirred and gave a sound, half sigh, half squeak, and pressed against the warmth. He was still too weak to move much more. Frank withdrew, his eyes glassy. "Not gonna lose you," he whispered. Just then, a soft knock on the metal door broke the moment. "Frank?" Mira's voice. "It's just me. I brought something." He opened the door. Mira stood in the drizzle, her hair tucked under a beanie now, a small canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. "I figured they might be hungry," she said. "I got some puppy formula and a bottle, vet stuff from a friend of my mom's." "Come in," Frank said, stepping aside. Mira entered, dripping lightly onto the floor. Her eyes darted to the pups. "They look better," she said softly. "Somewhat." She crouched beside them and began preparing the formula. Frank watched her hands, steady and practiced. She really had done this before. "You used to have pets?" he asked. She hesitated. "Sort of. When I was a kid, we took in strays. My mom couldn't say no, but after Dad left and we had to move into the duplex, it was harder. No pets allowed." Frank nodded, unsure what to say. Mira glanced up. "What about you?" He thought for a moment. My son had a dog, big shepherd. Named him Rex. Smart, loyal, never left his side. What happened to him? Frank didn't answer. Mira seemed to understand. She turned back to the pups. They're gonna make it, you know. Frank wished he shared her certainty. While she worked, he drifted over to his cluttered desk and picked up a small wooden box. It had once held fishing lures, now covered in dust. Inside were old snapshots, faded Polaroids of boats, dock workers, and Daniel, always smiling. One picture showed Daniel, maybe 13, trying to teach Rex how to shake. Frank ran his thumb over the image. I think they chose me, he said quietly. Mira looked over. What? These pups. I think they found me for a reason. She smiled. Maybe they knew you needed them too. He didn't answer, but his expression softened. That afternoon, Mira left with a promise to return the next day. Frank returned to the pups. Cole licked his wrist as he adjusted the towel. Ash nuzzled under his palm without waking. Frank sat down beside them on the floor. For once, he didn't mind the cold seeping through the concrete. He closed his eyes and rested his hand on their fur. The sky had turned a leaden gray, casting Eldermere in a colorless hush. Morning came not with sunlight, but with a dull haze that settled low over rooftops and swallowed the tops of buildings. Seagulls cawed somewhere beyond the fog, their voices thin and distant. Inside the garage, the heater hissed a dry, warm breath into the space, but it couldn't stop the chill in Frank's chest. Ash had stopped eating. For the past 2 feedings, the little pup had refused even the bottle Mira had brought. His breathing had grown faint, the rise and fall of his chest barely visible beneath the old wool coat. Frank sat beside him on the cold concrete, one hand gently resting on the fragile ribs, willing warmth into the body beneath his fingers. Cole lay curled at Ash's side, whimpering occasionally, licking his brother's ear as if trying to wake him from a deepening sleep. Frank's jaw was clenched so tightly it ached. It had only been a few days, just a handful of fog-choked mornings and quiet hours, but already the idea of losing this pup felt unbearable. He stood and paced, rubbing a hand over his face. There was an option, a real one. Mira had left a sticky note by the light switch with the name and address of a local vet. Dr. Ellie Wren, compassionate, doesn't judge. Frank stared at the note now, heart pounding. To take Ash there would mean opening the garage door, walking past the edges of his grief, and stepping back into the world he had sworn never to face again. The world that had taken Daniel. The world that had called off the search before sunset and written him off as another careless father. Frank hadn't spoken to more than 5 people in as many years. He gripped the edge of the workbench, knuckles white. Ash let out a sound, barely more than a whisper, a gasp, maybe, a fading breath. Frank moved. He pulled on his coat, wrapped Ash gently in the thickest towel he could find, and carried him out into the fog. The veterinary clinic sat nestled between a laundromat and a bait shop on 6th Street, its windows glowing soft yellow against the dull sky. A simple sign read, Wren's Clinic, walk-ins welcome. Frank stepped through the front door and was immediately hit by the smell of antiseptic and lavender. It was warmer than he expected. Clean. Quiet. At the front desk sat a woman in her late 40s, tall and lean with a composed, observant expression. Her blonde hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, and she wore pale blue scrubs beneath a thick cardigan. Her eyes, the color of winter rain, flicked up the moment he entered. Dr. Ellie Wren. Walk in? She asked, setting down a clipboard. Frank nodded once, eyes not meeting hers. Puppy, hurt. Not eating. Her gaze dropped to the bundle in his arms, and something softened in her face. Come with me. She led him through a side door into a clean, bright examination room. A gentle classical piano melody hummed from a speaker tucked in the corner. Frank laid Ash carefully on the metal table, unwrapping him layer by layer. Ellie moved like someone used to fragile things, slow, deliberate, respectful. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She simply examined Ash with steady hands and a murmured calm. After several minutes, she stepped back. He's underweight, she said gently. Has a head contusion that's healing poorly, signs of mild hypothermia, and he's dehydrated. His brother? At home, better? Ellie nodded. This one needs IV fluids and observation. He's not critical, but he's close. You got a name for him? Ash. her lips curved into something near a smile. That suits him. Frank stood silently, watching her insert the needle with practiced ease. Ash didn't even flinch. Ellie looked up. "You're the man from the harbor, aren't you?" Frank tensed. "I didn't mean it like that," she added quickly. "Eldermere talks, but not always cruelly. I've seen you near the docks. My husband. He was Navy too. Lost him in the Atlantic, 2009. Frank looked up. He never came back. But part of him stayed in the water. I think you understand that." They stood in silence, the hum of the IV pump the only sound between them. "I don't do people," Frank said finally. "That's all right," Ellie replied. "I mostly do animals." She handed him a seat. He sat. Over the next hour, Frank watched her care for Ash with a reverence he hadn't expected. She talked softly, even to a half-conscious pup. She hummed as she checked his vitals. She spoke to him as if he might answer. Frank found himself listening, to her, to the music, to Ash's breathing steadying with each drop of fluid. When the hour was up, Ellie removed the IV and gently lifted Ash into a fresh towel-lined basket. "He'll be okay," she said. "You can take him home, but keep him warm and hydrated, and bring him back tomorrow, all right?" Frank nodded, swallowing something hard in his throat. At the front desk, Ellie handed him a small bag, formula, syringes, a few pills. "Free of charge," she said before he could protest. "Consider it a veteran's discount." He met her eyes then. There was no pity in them, only understanding. As he stepped back into the misty street, Ash tucked under his coat once more, Frank realized something that left him oddly breathless. He hadn't spoken that much to anyone in years, and it hadn't broken him. The following morning arrived behind a curtain of silver drizzle. Mist wrapped around the corners of Eldermere like gauze, softening the hard lines of its shuttered shops and cracked sidewalks. Frank stood in the middle of the garage, holding Ash in one arm and gripping the bag of vet supplies with the other. Cole paced in a slow, protective circle around them, ears half raised, tail low and cautious. Frank had slept only a few hours, nodding off between careful feedings and half-whispered reassurances. Ash had stabilized, but his movements were slow, his appetite unpredictable. Frank wasn't taking any chances. He was heading back to Dr. Ellie Wren. Cole whimpered softly as Frank placed Ash in a folded blanket within the plastic crate Mira had dropped off earlier. The old dog bowl next to the heater was now filled with fresh water. Frank gave Cole a last pat and a promise. He'd return soon. The streets were nearly empty at that hour. The fog dampened even the sound of his boots. By the time Frank pushed open the clinic's door, Ellie was already at the counter, arranging files into neat little piles with the kind of care only someone deeply rooted in routine could muster. She looked up and smiled, genuine, but not too wide, as if she understood that anything brighter might scare him off. "Good morning, sailor," she said, gesturing to the exam room with a flick of her pen. "Room's ready." Frank gave a tight nod and carried Ash inside. Ellie followed. Today she wore the same blue scrubs under a charcoal cardigan, a small sunflower pin affixed to her chest pocket. She moved with the same fluid efficiency as the day before, quiet, grounded, and not one to ask unnecessary questions. She ran her hands gently over Ash's frame, checked his pupils, his temperature, and the pulse in his tiny neck. Frank watched every move. "He's improving," she said. "Still needs another couple of days of support, but he's stronger than I expected." Frank exhaled through his nose, relief worn like a mask. Ellie reached for a sterile pad to clean around Ash's eye. As she lifted his head slightly, something caught her attention. She leaned in closer. "Wait," she murmured. "What is it?" Frank asked. Ellie didn't respond at first. She used a small handheld magnifier to study the area behind Ash's left ear. Her brow furrowed. She stepped to a cabinet, retrieved a vial of dye solution, and dabbed it gently along the skin. A faint discoloration bloomed beneath the fur, a series of tiny, deliberate puncture marks. Uniform. Precise. "These aren't scratches from another animal," she said, voice flat. "They were made with something metal, probably hooked." Frank stepped closer. "Hooked?" Ellie nodded. "And this?" She lifted Ash's front leg slightly. "There's bruising here that suggests a tight restraint. Not a rope, a chain. Probably rusted." Frank's throat tightened. "This wasn't just someone being cruel," she added. "This was staged." He looked at her, trying to read something more in her eyes. Ellie held his gaze. Whoever did this wanted them to be found. They left a message. The silence between them grew thick. Frank turned away, jaw clenched. They were left on the old pier, bound over a mooring post. If I hadn't been walking, "You think they were left for you?" she asked, not unkindly. "I don't know," he shook his head, "but I can't shake the feeling." Ellie exhaled, removed her gloves, and folded them neatly. "I've seen a lot of abuse cases," she said. "But this isn't just cruelty. This is performance." She crossed to her desk and pulled open a drawer. From within, she produced a small manila folder, slightly weathered, stamped with a yellowed label. Animal Welfare Reports, 2022-2024. Over the last 18 months, 4 other cases like this came in through my clinic. Different breeds, all under 6 months old, all found in public places with signs of restraint. Metal chains, barbed wire, makeshift collars. But no one talks about it because they were strays, found by sanitation workers usually. Frank sat down slowly. "You report it?" "Every time, no follow-ups, no arrests." She paused, then added, 3 of the dogs didn't make it." Ash let out a soft, sleepy sigh in his crate. Ellie looked over at him, eyes softening. "He might." Frank sat in silence for a long time. His hand rested on the edge of the exam table, fingers twitching slightly. Ellie turned back to him. "I don't know what you plan to do, Frank, but if you think this was targeted, you need to be careful. I've made a lot of enemies," he muttered, "but most of them are ghosts." "Then maybe it's time to start hunting the living ones." Later, as Frank stepped back out into the misty street, Ash nestled close to his chest once more. He noticed something unusual on the side of the building, just above a storm drain, half concealed by wet ivy. A small, rusted length of chain nailed into the base of the wall. Not new, but not decades old either. He stared at it for a long moment, then turned and walked briskly away. Back in the clinic, Ellie closed Ash's file and stared out the window. Her reflection in the glass looked pale and worn. Her fingers brushed the sunflower pin on her pocket, an old token from her late husband, who used to say that even the darkest ocean gives back light if you wait long enough. She hoped Frank was the kind of man who would wait. Eldermere was never truly silent, not even at dawn. The fog may have cloaked the town in cotton-thick hush, but beneath it, there were always sounds. Distant gulls, the creak of damp wood, the faint groan of boats anchored too long in one place. The air that morning carried a scent sharp with rust and seaweed, heavy enough to make you hold your breath. Frank had returned from the clinic an hour before sunrise. Ash, wrapped snug in a blanket, now lay sleeping beside Cole inside the garage. The heater hummed gently, casting a warm glow across the concrete floor. Frank sat on the edge of the workbench, sipping instant coffee gone cold, staring blankly at the oil-stained wall. His mind wasn't here. It drifted between Ellie's words and the rusted chain he'd seen outside her clinic. He hadn't told her about it. Not yet. A sharp knock broke the stillness. 3 taps. Quick. Urgent. Frank stood, heart tensing. He opened the side door slowly, expecting Mira with more supplies or perhaps Ellie checking in before clinic hours. But the alley was empty. Almost. Taped to the door was a piece of printer paper, its edges curled from moisture. Large block letters printed in bold black ink glared up at him. "Leave it. You don't know who you're messing with." There was no name, no signature, just those words. Frank pulled it down slowly, scanning the alley. Nothing stirred except the shifting fog. The small security light above the door flickered once, then held steady. He folded the letter into quarters and slipped it into his coat pocket. Just as he turned to go back inside, a second shape stepped into view. Mira. She was coming down the alley from the main street, her hands stuffed in the pockets of a yellow raincoat too big for her frame. The hood fell back as she walked, revealing hair still damp from the ocean mist. "You saw it?" she asked, stopping a few feet away. He nodded. "I was coming to check on the pups. Found it first." Frank looked at her face, drawn tighter than usual. Mira was normally quick with a quip or a raised eyebrow. This morning, her eyes held something older than 17. Concern wrapped in caution. "I tore down another one," she said, pulling a crumpled paper from her pocket. It was stapled to the telephone pole 2 blocks from here. Same message, same font. Frank unfolded it. The same words stared back at him. "You think this is connected to the dogs?" Feels like it, Mira said. But I think it's more than that. She pulled her backpack around and unzipped the front pocket. Inside was a rolled-up poster, weatherproof, printed in color. She handed it to Frank. He unrolled it. It was one of her missing pet flyers, the ones she'd been putting up around Eldermere. The photo of Ash and Cole, snapped on her phone 2 days ago, was printed in the corner, above the words, "Found injured, seeking info." Someone had written across it in permanent marker, "You should have left them to die." Frank stared at it. He didn't speak. Mira swallowed hard. "Whoever did this, they saw the flyer. They know we're looking." Frank moved to the workbench, cleared a spot, and laid the 2 notes and the defaced flyer side by side. Mira joined him, her breath fogging in the cold air. "You think it's one person?" she asked. Frank nodded slowly. "One or a group. Either way, they want silence." "But why threaten you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into a drawer beneath the bench and pulled out a small, weathered photo album. Mira watched silently as he flipped through the yellowed pages. Images of a boy, a dog, a boat, a family before grief. He stopped at a page where a teenage boy stood beside a German shepherd, both soaking wet and laughing. The edges of the photo had been chewed by time. "My son, Daniel," Frank said quietly, "died in a storm. Took the boat out when he wasn't supposed to. The dog, Rex, waited all night for him at the dock." Mira said nothing, but her fingers lightly touched the corner of the photo. "I couldn't save him," Frank added, "but maybe I can save these 2. Mira looked up at him. "Then we don't back down." Frank nodded once. "No, we don't." Later that afternoon, Mira returned home briefly and came back with something wrapped in a cloth napkin. 3 small surveillance stickers and a used GoPro she had borrowed from a neighbor who ran a bait shop. The neighbor, Earl Lundy, was a quiet man in his 60s with a faded tattoo of a marlin on his forearm and a missing pinky finger he never explained. Earl had a soft spot for Mira and a sharper eye than most gave him credit for. "He lets me use it when I catch punks keying cars," Mira said, handing it over. "It might help. We can mount it above the alley." Frank wasn't used to teamwork, let alone surveillance. But he took the camera and the stickers, and together they fixed it near the top corner of the garage, angled toward the alley's mouth. Afterward, they sat on milk crates by the garage door, sipping weak tea from mismatched mugs. Cole slept curled at their feet. Ash stirred now and then from his crate, but mostly rested in quiet trust. "You think they will come back?" Mira asked. "I think they never really left." That night, Frank stood by the heater long after Mira had gone home. He unfolded the anonymous note again, then slowly turned it over. On the back, in the faintest pencil scratch, almost invisible unless the light hit just right, was a name. Haskins. He stared at it for a long time, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't heard that name in years. The fog rolled back that morning like a tide in reverse, and for the first time in days, sunlight broke through the veil of Eldermere. The golden shafts danced across rooftops and curled into alleyways, catching on broken glass and cracked paint like a gentle apology. In Frank's garage, the light filtered through a narrow window, casting a warm square onto the floor where Ash lay sleeping beside Cole. Frank stood nearby, pouring a small amount of formula into a ceramic bowl. The heater purred softly behind him, its familiar hum almost comforting now. Cole raised his head, ears perked at the sound of the spoon tapping the edge of the dish. Ash stirred beside him, blinked twice, then pushed himself up slowly on trembling legs. Frank froze, spoon in midair. Ash took a step forward, small, clumsy, but sure. He nudged Cole out of the way with a surprising grunt of insistence, then lowered his head and began to drink. It was the first time Ash had eaten unassisted. Frank didn't speak, didn't move. He only watched, letting the moment settle into his bones like heat after frost. He didn't realize he was smiling until Cole came over and licked his boot, tail swishing gently across the floor. The pups had survived the storm, and so, it seemed, had something inside him. Later that morning, Mira arrived with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a grocery bag in the other. Her yellow raincoat was replaced by a denim jacket with iron-on patches and ink scribbles across the sleeves. Band names, doodles, a quote in faded Sharpie that read, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, some are strong at the broken places." "Someone looks better," she said as she stepped inside and spotted Ash at the bowl. Frank nodded. He's eating on his own. I brought more formula, puppy pads, and a notebook, she said, unloading supplies. Thought we could track their weight and vitals. You know, be scientific about it. Frank raised an eyebrow. You always this prepared? Mira shrugged. Control freak. Runs in the blood. My mom used to make me chart my fevers. She crouched beside the pups. Ash wagged his tail once and pressed against her hand. Cole flopped dramatically onto his side, letting out a theatrical sigh. They're bonding, she said, grinning. You name them yet? Frank hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. He scratched behind Cole's ear. That one's Cole. Strong, quiet, tough to burn out. He touched Ash's head gently. This one's Ash. Fragile, but still warm. Survived fire. Mira looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her eyes. You think you're the fire? Frank met her gaze, then looked away. I think I was. Maybe still am. She didn't press the point. Instead, she pulled out the notebook and started drawing a grid. They spent the next hour together, feeding, cleaning, documenting. Mira showed Frank how to check hydration, using skin elasticity, how to estimate temperature without a thermometer, and how to clean ears gently with a cotton pad soaked in warm water. Frank listened. He didn't talk much, but his eyes followed everything she did. Around noon, Mira took a break to check her phone and frowned. My mom's working a double again. Said there was a wreck on Highway 19. Might not be home tonight. Frank said nothing, but he noticed how her fingers clenched the phone a little tighter than necessary. You okay? He asked. Mira nodded, too fast. Yeah, just hate being alone in that house. It's too quiet. Frank walked over to the workbench, pulled open a drawer, and fished out a small portable radio. He turned the dial until a faint jazz station crackled to life. He placed it near her. Static's better than silence. Mira blinked, then smiled. Thanks. Just as they were finishing up, a knock sounded at the side door. 2 quick taps. Frank tensed. He walked over cautiously and opened it. Outside stood a man in his 30s, lean, with sandy brown hair, a sun-worn ball cap, and an oil-stained hoodie. His hands were calloused, his boots scuffed. He held a clipboard and a roll of duct tape. Hey there, the man said. Sorry to bother you. I'm Ethan from the city's public works, just checking on illegal signage complaints. We've had someone posting missing pet flyers on stop signs and electrical boxes. Frank narrowed his eyes. That a crime now? The man shrugged. Technically, it's a violation. City code, blah, blah. I don't care personally, just doing my rounds. You see who's been putting them up? Mira stepped into view behind Frank. Me, she said. It's me. Ethan looked at her, then at Frank. You live here? Frank's voice was steady. She helps me with the dogs. They were injured. We're looking for whoever hurt them. Ethan frowned. Well, sorry about the trouble. Just needed to log a contact. City's been getting pressure lately from property owners. He scratched his head. Between you and me, I don't give a damn about flyers, but maybe be careful. Not everyone's friendly about strays. Frank thanked him and closed the door. The click echoed. They exchanged a glance. That felt weird, Mira muttered. Frank nodded. He knew too much for someone doing rounds. They both looked down at the pups. Ash was curled up next to Cole, belly full, breath slow and even. Frank reached out and ran his hand gently along Ash's back. Still warm. Still here. The shipyard sat at the ragged edge of Eldermere like a wound left too long to fester. Rust had overtaken steel, and barnacles clung to the legs of forgotten piers like the town's secrets were trying to crawl back into the sea. The abandoned dry docks and shuttered warehouses had become a haven for everything unwanted. Graffiti, wild dogs, and on more than one occasion, trouble. Mira Ortega had grown up being told not to go near it, which of course only made her go more often. That Saturday morning, she stood at the edge of the shipyard fence, holding her bike with one hand and squinting through the links. The fog had lifted, revealing the half-sunken hulls and collapsed sheds like bones scattered across the shoreline. Beside her were 2 of her friends, Zeke Hammond, a wiry 15-year-old with a perpetual slouch and the look of someone born suspicious, and Junie Bell, 13, with a mop of red curls, oversized glasses, and the constant smell of cinnamon gum. Zeke had grown up in the trailer park north of Main Street. His clothes never quite fit, and his speech was peppered with sarcasm and half-mumbled truths. Junie, on the other hand, was a walking encyclopedia who spoke with the speed of a kid who always had more to say than time allowed. "You sure they hang out here?" Zeke asked, chewing the corner of his hoodie sleeve. Mira nodded. "2 nights ago, I saw smoke coming from that storage container." She pointed toward a rust-colored box sitting near the edge of the dock. "No one from the city is working here. Someone's squatting." Junie pushed her glasses up. "Could be fishermen." "Not unless they're fishing with spray cans and bad intentions," Mira muttered. She didn't say it aloud, but she'd also noticed something else. Fresh paw prints near the same container. Small ones. Puppy-sized. They had been smeared with oil and trailed into the shadows before disappearing altogether. Her heart had stung when she saw them. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together. A few of the town's more unruly teens had been whispered about in gas station corners and hushed PTA meetings. Kids with no after-school plans and too much anger tucked under their sleeves. One name kept coming up. Connor Ortega, Mira's older brother. He wasn't here anymore, not physically. Connor had been sent away a year ago after he and 2 friends broke into a warehouse and were caught setting a mattress on fire for laughs. No one was hurt, but the judge had made an example out of them. He was 17 then, now 18 and serving time in a youth correctional facility an hour inland. Mira still hadn't forgiven him, but she also hadn't stopped writing to him, even if he never replied. She kept that detail private. "I say we go check it out," Zeke said, already halfway through the gap in the fence. "Wait," Junie hissed. "What if they're there? We act like we're looking for scrap, old bike parts or something." Mira followed without answering, ducking through the fence and jogging lightly across the overgrown path. The scent of salt, rust, and something faintly sour followed them as they weaved through the ruins of the old ship repair yard. A collapsed crane loomed like a broken arm above them. As they neared the container, voices floated on the wind, low, masculine, teenage. "I'm telling you, man, if someone saw you, you're screwed." "No one saw me. I wore gloves." Mira signaled for Zeke and Junie to crouch behind a stack of rotting pallets. She peeked through a crack between boards. 3 boys sat on the ledge of the container's open door. One of them she recognized immediately. Logan Vance, lanky, long-haired, with a permanent sneer and a black hoodie he never seemed to take off. He'd been 2 grades above Mira before he dropped out. The other 2 she didn't know by name, one short and muscular, the other thin and twitchy with acne-scabbed skin. "I don't care," Logan said, tossing a rock into the water. "If that old guy's got the dogs, we wait till he's asleep. Get them back." "Tied him good last time," muttered the smaller one. Mira's heart pounded. Zeke whispered, "Did he just say—" Junie clamped a hand over his mouth. Mira kept watching. The boys talked for a few more minutes about showing them a lesson and, next time, fire maybe. Then, as casually as if discussing lunch, they stood and walked off toward the back fence, vanishing into the trees that bordered the shipyard. She waited 5 minutes before moving. Once the coast was clear, they approached the container. Inside were empty beer bottles, a stack of waterlogged comic books, and a few tattered blankets. But in the back corner was something worse, a length of rusted chain coiled neatly, stained at one end with something dark. Nearby, half a collar. Cut. Frayed. Zeke picked it up, then dropped it like it burned. "It's them, the dogs." Junie swallowed. "We should call the police." Mira didn't respond immediately. She stared at the chain, at the collar, at the pile of fast food wrappers next to a backpack with a Connor Ortega. 2022 patch still stitched on the side. Her brother's. Her fingers curled. "No cops yet," she said. "Not until I talk to someone first." Back at the garage that evening, Frank was changing out the pup's bedding when Mira arrived. Her jacket was streaked with dirt, her eyes darker than usual. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Did you ever know a kid named Logan Vance?" Frank straightened slowly. "Used to run errands for the shipyard foreman. Got caught stealing gas. Why?" Mira told him everything about the container, the chain, the voices, and the backpack. When she mentioned her brother's name, Frank didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. He just waited until she finished. "You think he's involved?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," she whispered, "but if he is, I want to hear it from him, not a headline." Frank sat beside the heater, the dog snuggled against his boot. "There's more than one kind of wound," he said. "Some are done with chains, Some are done with silence. Mira nodded, and outside the wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of salt, rust, and reckoning. The night crept in soft and slow, as if Eldermere itself was holding its breath. The wind had quieted, and the sea, just blocks away, lapped gently against the crumbling dock walls. In Frank's garage, everything was still. The heater clicked off with a dull sigh. A clock ticked. The only light came from a small desk lamp, casting long shadows over the concrete floor and the slumbering bodies of Ash and Cole, curled together like twin commas in a sentence waiting to be finished. Frank sat slouched in his armchair, his coat draped across his lap, head tilted back. Sleep had come without asking. Heavy. Absolute. In his dream, the garage was gone. He was standing on a beach he hadn't walked in years, not since the day they'd pulled his son's wrecked boat from the rocks. But now, it looked different. Calm, golden. The waves were soft and rhythmic, and the sky glowed like it was painted in amber oil. And then there was Daniel. His son looked as he had at 16, tall, sun-browned, with a cowlick that refused to be tamed. His laugh echoed across the beach, warm and unafraid. In his hands was a tennis ball. At his feet, bounding through the shallows, was Rex, the old family German shepherd, alive again, fur damp, tongue lolling. Daniel tossed the ball. Rex gave chase, but this time 2 smaller shapes followed, Ash and Cole. The pups barked gleefully, tails whipping like metronomes, their clumsy legs kicking up sprays of sand as they trailed behind the bigger dog. Daniel dropped to his knees and caught Ash in his arms, laughing as the pup licked his face. Cole leaned against him like he'd belonged there all along. Frank watched from a distance, frozen. Daniel turned toward him, smile wide. "You don't have to keep punishing yourself, Dad." Frank tried to speak. No sound came. Daniel tilted his head, the way he used to when he was curious. "You still have time. Don't waste it." Then the scene faded. Not abruptly, but like a painting being slowly erased by morning light. Frank woke with a sharp inhale, eyes wet, breath unsteady. The garage was silent again, but as if summoned from the dream, a soft yip cut through the stillness. Ash. He was awake, padding slowly toward Frank's chair. Cole followed a step behind, both tails wagging, small feet tapping softly on the floor. Frank leaned forward, knelt slowly, and gathered them into his lap. He held them there for a long while. Later that day, the light outside shifted from gray to something brighter. Spring, long reluctant to arrive, seemed to test the edges of Eldermere with faint warmth and the scent of thawing earth. Frank cleared a space at the old workbench. It had been years since he'd painted, really painted, not just dabbed colors into vague ocean shapes. The easel had gathered dust, but the brushes were still there, neatly rolled in a canvas wrap that Daniel had once bought him for Father's Day. He unrolled them carefully, stiff bristles, handles dulled from use. Ash barked once from across the room. Frank looked up, smiled faintly, and dipped the first brush in water. The canvas sat blank, white as new snow, but his mind saw the image already. A boy standing on a deck, wind in his hair, one hand holding the railing. 2 dogs by his side, one proud, one uncertain, both looking out toward a sea that promised something more than loss. He began to paint. The strokes came slowly at first. Broad swaths of sky, a jagged coastline, a suggestion of mast and sail. The boy came next. A silhouette. Then the hair. The tilt of the head. The unmistakable grin. Frank didn't need reference photos. Every detail was etched behind his eyes. He paused to give the canvas time to dry and turned instead to a drawer he hadn't opened in years. Inside were more sketches. Pencil outlines of boats, waves. Daniel as a toddler with a toy anchor. He pulled one out, yellowed and curled at the edges, and placed it beside the easel. His hand shook slightly as he added Ash and Cole to the new canvas. They came to life with surprising ease. Ash's narrow face, alert and curious. Cole's broader stance, always one step behind, always watching. They stood close to the boy, almost protective, as if guarding something sacred. When he finished the outline, he stepped back and stared. The garage was no longer just a garage. It was a studio, a sanctuary, a place where ghosts could sit quietly and not ask to be buried. That evening, Mira returned with a plastic container of leftover soup and a small gift bag with tissue paper sticking out. "Mom made too much," she said, setting the container on the counter. "And I saw this at the thrift store. Figured you could use it." Frank opened the bag to find a leather collar, worn but sturdy, and a metal name tag blank on one side. He turned it over. The other side read, "Ash and Cole, safe now." Frank's throat tightened. "They deserve to be named," Mira said, crouching beside the pups. "Out loud, in metal, something permanent." "They're more than just dogs," Frank murmured. "Yeah," Mira whispered. "They're part of the story now." That night, as the sea whispered outside and the heater pulsed a soft rhythm through the garage, Frank added the final stroke to the painting. A sunrise breaking over the water. Not a storm, not a wreck, but light. It began with a flyer taped to the inside of a library window. Mira hadn't even been looking for it, just passing by with a borrowed book in hand, when the words "Free Adoption Event, Port Paws Foundation" caught her eye. There was a photo of a smiling volunteer holding a Labrador puppy, a line of bright banners behind her. The font was playful, the logo warm and family-friendly, a red heart cradling a paw print. But what drew Mira's attention wasn't the dog. It was the date printed on the bottom, March 18th, 2022. She pulled out her phone and opened the photos folder where she'd saved screenshots from earlier research. One of them, an old local news article, featured a similar picture from the same event. Different pup, same backdrop. But what linked them was the name. Adopted by Port Paws, and another, and another. Each time a rescued puppy appeared in a flyer or news piece, Mira noticed a troubling pattern. There was no record of them beyond that point. No follow-up adoptions. No vet reports. No digital trail. Just gone. That afternoon, Mira sat hunched at Frank's workbench, the edges of her laptop glowing blue in the dim light of the garage. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up city records, animal control reports, and cached social media posts that had long since disappeared from public view. Frank sat nearby, polishing a brush he hadn't used in years, though his eyes drifted more often to the screen than the bristles. 23 puppies, Mira muttered, in the last 18 months, all listed as rescued by Port Paws. But I can't find a single verified adoption. Frank didn't speak, but his jaw tightened. "They have a facility," she continued. "Downtown, supposedly a kennel and outreach center. But the windows are blacked out and their social media is curated. Nothing behind the scenes, no vet partnerships listed, just happy volunteers and stock footage." Frank finally set the brush down. "That's not a rescue, that's a front." Mira nodded grimly. She scrolled through another page and stopped. "Here, listen to this." The headline read, "Missing Golden Retriever Puppy Found Near Boneyard Pier, 4th this year." The body of the article was short, the photo even shorter, but it was enough. "The markings on this one," Mira leaned in, "look familiar?" Frank took the screen and squinted. The puppy had a thin stripe of white across its snout, a nearly identical marking to Cole's. "They could be siblings," he said. "They probably are." The next morning, they visited the only animal control officer in Eldermere who hadn't brushed them off. Greta Lane, a no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s with a sharp bob haircut and a collection of dog hair on every jacket she owned. Greta stood 5'4", but moved like a 6-foot sergeant, and her idea of diplomacy was letting her silence do the talking. She met them behind the shelter, cigarette dangling from her lips, clipboard in hand. "You think Port Paws is laundering dogs?" she asked flatly. Mira nodded. "And worse, we think they're faking rescues, maybe staging them. Puppies show up abused, abandoned, but maybe it's by design." Greta exhaled a plume of smoke and tossed the butt in a can of stale coffee. "I've suspected something was off with them for a while. All that donation money, but none of the usual red tape, no licensing drama, no vet signatures. And they never ask us for help." "Why not report them?" Frank asked. "Because they've got friends on the city council, a couple on the Chamber of Commerce. People love their annual events, their heartstring videos. If I go at them without proof, it'll bounce right back on me." Frank folded his arms. "So, what would count as proof?" Greta glanced around, lowered her voice. "Someone on the inside, or something physical, a record, a photo, a shipment. Anything that links them to the dogs after the rescue them." She pulled a business card from her pocket and handed it to Mira. "If you find something, you call me directly. Not the front desk. Not the mayor's office." Mira took the card, nodded, and tucked it into her phone case. Later that night, Frank sat on the garage floor with ash and coal nuzzled against his sides. Mira flipped through a notebook filled with scribbles, leads, names. On the wall behind them hung the unfinished painting of Daniel and the dogs. But tonight, Frank wasn't painting. He was planning. "I used to know a guy," he said slowly. "Used to handle cargo for offshore shipping companies. Quiet, shady work. His name's Haskins." Mira looked up sharply. Frank continued. "He used to work the same docks Port Paws now uses for their pet food donations. I saw that name written faintly on the back of the letter they left me." Mira's expression tightened. "Think it's connected?" "I'd bet my bones." She reached over and touched Ash's head. "Then we need to go deeper." It was the kind of rain that didn't fall in drops, but in mist, wetting everything, clinging to skin, smearing windows until the world outside looked like a half-finished painting. Frank stood across the street from a squat, windowless building marked Port Paws Foundation Animal Hope Initiative. The sign was bright, new, too clean for a place reeking of rot. Mira waited behind him, tucked beneath a navy umbrella. Her hood was up, curls peeking out. She held Ash's collar loosely in her free hand, though the pup wasn't with them today. They weren't here to adopt or ask questions. They were here to watch. The glass door to the Port Paws facility opened with a chime, and out stepped a man Frank hadn't seen in over a decade. Tall, broad in the shoulders, black boots, and over all of it, a yellow raincoat. Hood up, but not enough to hide the sloped nose, the rough jawline, the sharp scar slicing down the left cheek like a cruel afterthought. He carried a clipboard in one hand, a cigarette in the other, and nodded cordially to someone holding a box of pet food behind him. But Frank wasn't fooled by the smile. His fingers tightened around the strap of his satchel. His breath hitched. "Him," he said, voice raw. Mira turned. "Who?" Frank's eyes never left the man. "Cal Haskins." Mira blinked. "The name from the letter?" Frank nodded once. A bitter memory uncoiled behind his eyes. Brine in his throat. The weight of a lifeless dog cradled in his arms. The echo of Daniel's last laugh before the sea turned cruel. Haskins had been there that day. The one who lent Daniel a gas can behind Frank's back. The one who'd laughed when Rex barked, then kicked the dog so hard he limped for weeks. Frank had warned him, threatened him. But Haskins vanished after Daniel's death. Now here he was, alive, thriving, wearing kindness like a mask. Across the street, Haskins flicked his cigarette into a puddle and turned. His gaze swept the sidewalk and landed briefly on Frank. His smile faltered, only for a second. But it was enough. Later that day, Frank sat in the garage, hands trembling, trying to make sense of what had just ripped open inside him. He hadn't said a word to Mira during the walk home, just clenched his fists and kept moving, jaw tight, shoulders rigid. Now he stood at the workbench, staring at the painting of Daniel and the two dogs. The brush he'd dropped earlier still lay on the floor. Mira sat across the room, watching quietly. She understood when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Finally, Frank's voice broke the silence. He used to work the South Dock, knew everyone, smiled at mothers, tossed candy to kids, but underneath, he shook his head. Haskins had rot in him, the kind that smells sweet until you cut it open. Mira swallowed. "What happened with Daniel?" Frank didn't answer right away. He moved to the shelf, pulled down a thin, battered folder, and handed it to her. Inside were weathered photographs, an old Coast Guard report, a police statement signed but half blacked out. One photo showed Daniel's boat, half submerged, mast split, ropes frayed like torn veins. "He took the boat out that morning," Frank said. "I was dead asleep. I told him no. Told him it wasn't safe." Mira flipped to the next page. There were rumors afterward that Haskins had sold him bad fuel, or something worse, that maybe he'd tampered with the rudder. Nothing provable. But after the storm, Haskins disappeared. Left Eldermere, no forwarding address. "And now he's back," Mira said softly, as the head of a rescue foundation. Frank gave a dry laugh. What better way to hide wolves than behind leashes? That evening, they drove past the Port Paws facility again, this time slower, with eyes on every corner. The building, shaped like an old freight office, had been recently renovated. The paint was fresh, the flower beds trimmed. But there were no barking dogs, no sounds of movement from inside. Just silence. Too perfect. They stopped at a nearby diner under the pretense of dinner, and while Mira stirred her tea, Frank slipped into the back booth and opened a newspaper he had picked up from the rack. Inside was a local feature article. Port Paws celebrates 2 years of compassion, an interview with director Calvin Haskins. A photo accompanied it. Haskins shaking hands with Eldermere's mayor, a woman with frosted curls and pearl earrings. Behind them, a banner, Hope, Healing, Home. Frank read every word. The article praised their low euthanasia rates, applauded their cutting-edge rehabilitation model, and mentioned an upcoming benefit dinner. But one sentence near the end chilled him. Port Paws recently expanded its operations to include private intake services, allowing owners to surrender animals discreetly, no questions asked. Frank folded the paper with a curse. Mira looked up. "What is it?" "They're buying time, creating a loophole. No records, no questions, just disappearances." She sat back, heart sinking, and the city's applauding them for it. Frank looked out the window. "We need someone on the inside." Back at the garage, Frank lit the old stove and brewed a cup of strong black coffee. Mira sat beside the pups, who were nuzzled together in their usual spot near the heater. Ash lifted his head and blinked at her, then rolled onto his back, tiny paws reaching skyward. "I can try," Mira said suddenly. Frank turned. "Try what?" "To get inside. I'm young. I volunteered before. I could say I'm looking to earn community hours. They'll buy it." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Too risky." She met his gaze, unflinching. "This isn't just about Ash and Cole anymore. It's about every dog that doesn't make it out." A long silence. Then Frank nodded once, slowly. "All right, but not alone." The interior of the Port Paws facility was quieter than Mira expected. Too quiet. The kind of stillness curated with precision. There were no barks echoing from the kennels, no scratch of claws on tile, only the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional muffled voice behind closed doors. For an animal rescue, it felt more like a clinic or a vault. Mira adjusted the lanyard around her neck. The badge, cheap plastic with the Port Paws logo, and her name scrawled beneath Volunteer Orientation Week, felt heavier than it looked. Her reflection in the glass door had surprised her that morning. Ponytail neat, shirt tucked in, the bright blue volunteer vest hanging loose over her hoodie. She looked younger, harmless. She kept her movements practiced, casual, restocking brochures, tidying the front desk, handing out water to visitors, but her eyes moved constantly. She counted the doors. 7. Only 2 labeled. One said admin, the other storage. The others remained closed. It wasn't until her 3rd shift that she met Gina, one of the full-time staff. Gina was in her late 30s, slim with pale skin and clipped speech. Her blonde hair was always pulled tight into a braid, and her eyes didn't blink enough. Mira quickly learned she was the kind of person who asked, "How are you?" but never waited for the answer. "You're the girl from West Eldermere High, right?" Gina asked, walking by with a clipboard. "Yeah, senior year." "You're early," Gina said without looking up. "We like that. Most kids just want the hours and bail. You might stick." Mira smiled politely. "I like animals." Gina's lips thinned. "Everyone says that." Later, as Mira mopped the back hallway, she heard barking, sharp, frightened. Not from the usual kennels, but deeper inside the building, behind one of the unmarked doors. The barking stopped abruptly, cut mid-yelp. She paused, her hand still on the mop handle. Then footsteps approached. Gina again. "Stay away from that end," she said, her tone clipped. "That's quarantine. Dangerous animals. We don't let new volunteers near them." Mira nodded, but her stomach tightened. That night, back at the garage, she relayed everything to Frank. He listened silently. Seated beside the heater, Ash and Cole curled on either side of his boots like sentries. "She lied," Mira said. "There's no way they have that many quarantine cases. And they never mentioned that room in orientation." Frank folded his arms. "Did you see anything?" "Not yet. But something's off. I think they're moving dogs in from outside, unregistered, and keeping them off the books." Frank's eyes darkened. It's not just a lie, it's a pipeline. The next day, Mira arrived early again. Too early. The receptionist, a college student named Bryce, looked up in surprise. "You're on afternoon shift today." "I thought I'd help out with inventory. Gina said we were short-staffed." Bryce shrugged. "Suit yourself." While he returned to his spreadsheet, Mira slipped down the hall and into the storage room, where she'd seen staff moving boxes labeled Supplies Kennel. She opened one. Blank tags, dozens, all with Port Paws Foundation pre-printed. None filled out. Another box, syringes. Not for vaccines, but sedatives. Xylazine, labeled for large animal use only. Way too strong for puppies. Her heart pounded. She took photos quickly, closed the boxes, turned, and froze. Gina stood in the doorway. For a moment, neither moved. Then Gina stepped in, shut the door softly behind her. "Curious girl," she said. Mira tucked her phone into her back pocket, trying not to show the shaking in her fingers. "I thought we were low on supplies." Gina tilted her head. "You're not like the others." Mira said nothing. Gina took a step forward. "You should leave, Mira. Some doors aren't meant to be opened." Before Mira could respond, the intercom buzzed overhead. "Gina to front. Visitor asking for you." Gina's eyes held Mira's for a moment longer. Then she left. By the time Mira got home that evening, the garage felt heavier. Frank met her at the door. "We've had visitors." "What?" He gestured behind him. The latch on the side door had been broken. The lights were off. Ash and Cole were safe, thank God, but the place had been ransacked, tools overturned, blankets shredded. The painting of Daniel had been pulled from the wall and lay face down on the ground. Mira's mouth went dry. "They came here." Frank picked up a metal tag that had been left in the pup's crate. It was blank. No name, no number. Just the Port Paws logo engraved in steel. That night, Frank sat on the floor beside Ash and Cole. Mira paced, phone in hand, too shaken to sit. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, Frank looked up. "We're past the edge now." Mira nodded. "So what do we do?" Frank's voice was steady, low. "We fight." The rain had returned by morning, and with it came a cold so sharp it seemed to seep through the walls of the garage. Frank stood in silence near the broken door. Its frame cracked inward as if forced by a boot. He'd boarded it up temporarily with a scrap of plywood, but the jagged edges still gaped like teeth, and the air inside the garage felt thinner now, violated. Ash lay on the blanket near the heater, one paw wrapped hastily in gauze. Blood had dried in thin lines on his foreleg, and though the wound wasn't deep, it was enough. Enough to ignite something ancient in Frank's chest. Rage, yes, but more than that, guilt. A hollowing fear he hadn't known since the day they found Daniel's boat. Cole wouldn't leave Ash's side. The pup hovered, restless, licking Ash's ears, nudging his snout, whining low in his throat like he was trying to sing his brother back to health. Mira stood nearby, arms crossed tight over her chest, her usually sharp expression dulled by exhaustion. Her voice, when it came, was flat. It wasn't just a warning this time. Frank nodded. They were looking for something. Or someone. He moved to the workbench, pulled open a drawer, and retrieved a rusted tin, one of the few things he'd kept locked. Inside was a map of the city, edges torn, corners marked with faded red pen. Dockyards, warehouses, old shipping lanes, and something else, a small photograph, years old. It showed a woman standing beside a pickup truck filled with dog crates. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked dark hair and heavy boots. Her name, scrawled on the back in pencil, was Monica Reyes. "She used to work at Port Paws," Frank said quietly, "before it was even called that, back when it was just a dockside shelter run out of shipping containers." Mira stepped closer. "What happened to her?" "She disappeared. No official record. But Greta, animal control officer, said Monica tried to blow the whistle years ago. Claimed some of the rescued dogs weren't being rehomed, that they were being sold, or worse." "Did she go to the police?" "She tried. Files vanished. She vanished." Mira's jaw clenched. "You think she's still alive?" "I think she's scared, and I think she still knows something." Frank glanced at Ash, then at the boarded-up door. "They know where we are now, which means we can't stay." That afternoon, Frank drove them through side streets and back alleys, avoiding main roads and keeping one eye on the rearview mirror. The rain came down in hard sheets, blurring the world beyond the windshield into grays and smudges. Mira sat in the passenger seat, holding Ash in her lap, Cole nestled between her feet. They pulled up outside a white house on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Dr. Ellie Wren's home. Frank hadn't seen Ellie since Mira had started her infiltration of Port Paws. But the light on her porch was still warm, and when she opened the door, her expression was exactly as he remembered, calm, kind, and somehow seeing more than anyone else. Ellie stood just under 6 feet, her shoulders squared from years of work, her frame lean but never frail. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled into a low twist, and her eyes, gray-blue like stormlight, met Frank's without flinching. "I figured it was time," she said. She stepped aside, letting them in without questions. The house smelled faintly of chamomile and antiseptic, the kind of mix that came from someone who lived between healing and vigilance. Photos lined the hallway, some of dogs, some of Ellie with a man in uniform, always smiling, always in the past. She led them to a guest room with soft lighting and a thick rug. Mira knelt beside the bed, placing Ash down gently. Cole curled beside him immediately. Ellie returned moments later with a fresh roll of gauze and a bottle of antiseptic spray. Frank hesitated. "I should have stopped this before it reached them." Ellie didn't scold. She cleaned Ash's paw, her touch gentle and practiced. "This isn't your failure, Frank," she said softly. "It's the sickness in the people who hurt them." Frank looked down at his hands. They were shaking slightly. "I need to find Monica Reyes," he said. "She's the missing link. If she's alive, she can testify. We can stop Port Paws." Ellie met his gaze. "You're not going alone." "I can't take Mira, not after this." "No," Ellie said firmly, "you can't, which is why she and the pups are staying here." Mira looked up, surprised. "You've done enough, Mira. You got us inside. You uncovered more than any adult in this town bothered to. But you're 17. You need to breathe, just for a few days." Mira hesitated, then nodded. "But promise me you'll come back." Frank almost smiled. "I haven't broken a promise yet." That night, Mira lay on the guest bed, the pups curled on either side of her. The storm outside rattled the window panes, but inside, the house was warm, safe. Frank sat with Ellie in the kitchen, sipping the strongest tea she had. On the table between them lay the photograph of Monica Reyes and Frank's map. "She used to live out near Beacon Hill," Ellie said. "Rented a trailer behind a mechanic shop, but she cut ties with everyone after she left Port Paws." Frank nodded slowly. "Then that's where I'll start." The rain had stopped, but the air still clung to Frank's skin like an unwelcome memory. The roads out toward Beacon Hill curled through the edges of Eldermere like a forgotten artery, one that hadn't seen repair in years. Mud splattered the underside of his boots as he stepped out of the truck, gravel crunching beneath each step. Ahead, behind a faded Conoco gas station, sat a single-wide trailer leaning slightly to one side, as though weary of holding up so many years of silence. Frank approached cautiously. A rusted wind chime rattled above the porch, its song shrill and brittle. Weeds choked the edges of the steps. No name on the mailbox. No curtains in the windows. But the smell of motor oil and burning pine still lingered. Someone lived here. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again. A shuffling sound came from within. Then a voice, low and scratchy, like gravel dragged across metal. "Go away, don't sell, don't pray." Frank cleared his throat. "I'm not here for either. I'm looking for Monica Reyes." A pause, then, "She's dead." Frank frowned. "That's a shame, because if she was alive, she might help bring down the man who's hurting animals the same way he hurt people." Another pause. Then the door cracked open an inch, just wide enough to reveal one sharp eye, gray, bloodshot, surrounded by crow's feet deep enough to hold dust. Then the eye widened. "Frank Halloway?" He didn't flinch, still breathing. The door opened fully. Standing there was Monica Reyes, 63 now, thinner than her photo, hair longer and streaked with white. Her jeans were stained with paint and engine grease. A navy work shirt hung loosely on her frame, the name Sam stitched in fading thread where her own should have been. Her hands were calloused, one wrapped in an old bandage, a fresh gash bleeding through the cloth. "You look like hell," she muttered. You don't. She stepped aside. Come in before the wind changes its mind. The trailer smelled like cigarette smoke and coffee left too long on the burner. A dog barked from the back. Hoarse, old. Monica motioned toward a chair beside a cluttered counter, then disappeared into the other room. She returned with a wooden box, the kind that had once held tools or memories. She placed it on the table, then sat across from him, her eyes never leaving his. I've been waiting for someone to come looking, she said. Didn't expect it to be you. Frank opened the box slowly. Inside was a folded oil-stained cloth, a few Polaroids, and a corroded brass name tag. Calvin Haskins, Port Facilities Supervisor. But it was the photograph beneath it that made Frank's breath catch. It had been taken the morning of the storm. From a distance, blurry, but unmistakable. Haskins in a yellow raincoat standing near the edge of the dock. One hand held a gas can, the other a short-barrel revolver pointed at something just outside frame. I took it with a long lens, Monica said. Wasn't trying to catch him, just the harbor mist. But when Daniel's boat went missing, I remembered. I blew up the photo. That's when I saw it. Frank's hand shook slightly. Why didn't you show this to the police? I did. Her voice turned bitter. They said it was too grainy, that it could be anyone, and Haskins had friends, then and now. Frank nodded slowly. He still does. Monica lit a cigarette with fingers that trembled only after the flame died. You think he's behind Port Paws? I don't think. I know, she exhaled. Then take the picture. You've got more left to lose than I do. Back in Eldermere, Frank didn't go home. He drove straight to the Eldermere Police Department, a squat brick building that smelled of mildew and coffee grounds. The same front desk officer as always. Bo Nelson, wide-shouldered, buzz-cut, and 2 years too close to retirement, nodded as Frank approached. Halloway, Bo said, you bringing us more theories? I've got proof this time. Frank placed the photograph and name tag on the counter. Bo raised a brow, then waved over Detective Lizette Tron, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a gray blazer that never quite matched her slacks. She flipped through the evidence, frowning. You're telling me this man, Haskins, is the same one running Port Paws now? Frank nodded. He staged a disappearance, changed the name, rebuilt everything, but he's still hurting animals, and maybe people. Tran studied the photo again, then Frank. You've made claims before, Mr. Halloway. About your son, about the dog. You filed a dozen reports back then, and none of them panned out. Frank's jaw clenched. Because no one looked past the surface. She tapped the photo. You said this is Monica Reyes's? She gave it to me today. And where's she now? Hiding, waiting to see if anyone finally listens. Tran sighed. You're not exactly a credible source anymore, Frank. That cut deeper than the words themselves. Frank took a breath. Just look into the building. Look into the supply chain. Talk to Ellie Wren. Talk to Greta Lane. They'll tell you what I've told them. Tran pocketed the photo. I'll look, but no promises. As Frank turned to leave, Bo muttered, Should have left ghosts buried, Frank. But Frank didn't stop, because this time, the ghosts weren't his. That night, back at Ellie's house, Mira met him at the door. Well? Frank shook his head. They don't believe me, not yet. She exhaled. Then, we make them believe. He handed her the photo. This is what truth looks like when it's 15 years too late. She stared at it, then at Frank. No, she said. It's 15 years early for someone else. Behind them, Ash barked once, weak but defiant. The storm broke over Eldermere with the fury of a god awakened. Wind screamed down from the cliffs, dragging sheets of rain sideways, turning alleyways into rivers and dock planks into slick traps. Lightning lit the sky in jagged veins, each flash revealing a landscape of ruin and metal. Cranes frozen mid-lift, shipping containers stacked like tombstones, and the sea churning in defiance just beyond the breakwall. Frank gripped the wheel tighter as the truck rumbled across the slippery dock road. His breath fogged the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. The photo from Monica Reyes lay on the seat beside him, protected in a Ziploc. The image of Haskins frozen in grainy defiance. Detective Tran hadn't followed up, and Frank had stopped waiting. The only thing more dangerous than being disbelieved was being right. He wasn't heading to the Port Paws building, not directly. The back access road by the abandoned shipping depot near the old cold storage units was where trucks came and went under the radar. Monica had told him to look there, but he wasn't alone. Headlights appeared in the mirror, too steady, too close. Frank pressed harder on the gas, tires skidding on the soaked concrete. The truck behind him accelerated. No honk, no flashing lights, just silent pursuit. He turned sharply into an alley between two container stacks, and the truck followed. Another turn, another. No escape. His engine sputtered as a sharp metallic clang rang out. Something had struck his back bumper. Hard. Frank veered and braked, sliding sideways across wet ground until the truck slammed against a storage crate. The seatbelt snapped across his chest, knocking the wind from his lungs. He fumbled for the door. Too late. A figure yanked it open. Tall, raincoat, black-gloved hands. A punch landed across Frank's jaw, splitting his lip and sending his head back against the headrest. Another hand reached for his collar, dragging him halfway out of the cab. Then, a sharp, furious bark tore through the storm. Ash. The pup launched from the shadows with reckless fury, fur slick with rain, eyes blazing. His teeth sank into the attacker's arm. Small, but enough to startle, enough to break the grip. Frank hit the ground hard, rolled, and reached instinctively for the crowbar under the seat. With a grunt, he swung. Metal met knee. The figure howled and stumbled back, swatting at Ash, who ducked beneath the blow and stood between Frank and the attacker, growling through blood and rain. The man limped backward, clutching his arm. Another flash of lightning illuminated his face. Gina. Not in her usual port paws attire, but a dark hood pulled low, jaw tight with something far colder than control. "Should have stayed in the garage, old man," she spat, voice unrecognizable beneath the thunder. Frank stood slowly, blood running from his lip, crowbar raised. But Gina didn't strike again. Instead, she turned and ran, vanishing behind the crates like a wraith swallowed by the storm. Ash trembled but didn't flinch. Frank dropped to one knee, reaching out. "Easy, boy, you're okay." Ash collapsed into his arms. 30 minutes later, soaked and bruised, Frank banged on Ellie's door. Mira opened it instantly, worry all over her face. "What?" "Ash saved my life," Frank rasped. "We need to move." Ellie appeared in the hallway, already pulling on her jacket. "Where's safe now?" Mira asked. Frank wiped blood from his lip. "Nowhere, but we make it safe." By sunrise, the storm had passed, but the town lay under a hush of wet silence. At the edge of the garage, Frank poured warm water over Ash's paws. Cole sat beside them, licking his brother's ear. "I shouldn't have taken him," Frank muttered. "He's just a pup." "He didn't hesitate," Mira said, kneeling beside them. "He knew what you meant to him." Frank said nothing, only placed his hand gently over Ash's ribcage, feeling the breath, the warmth, the life. Behind him, Ellie stood with a towel, her face grim. "You were lucky," she said. "Ash's jaw's bruised, not broken, but he's going to need time." Frank looked up. "We all are." That afternoon, Mira sat on the garage floor, Cole curled in her lap, while Frank patched the broken door once more. Outside, puddles shimmered with the last light of day. Mira pulled something from her pocket, a folded flyer from Port Paws. On the back, scribbled in small print, she'd noticed something days ago, but hadn't thought much of it until now. A line of code, not a date, not a phone number, coordinates. She looked up. "Frank?" The morning broke in pale gold, but the town of Eldermere remained wrapped in a hush that felt more like tension than peace. In the garage, still smelling of wet wood and iodine, Mira sat hunched at Frank's old desk with her laptop open and eyes red from a sleepless night. Ash lay dozing nearby, bandaged paw twitching now and then, while Cole refused to move farther than a few inches from his side. Frank was in the back, silent, patching the dented fender of the truck by hand. Every movement was slow, mechanical, like a man trying to stitch together something bigger than steel. Mira stared at the video editor on her screen. The footage wasn't perfect. Most of it came from old phone recordings, shots of Ash and Cole when they first arrived, shaky glimpses of the aftermath of the break-in, a grainy image of the Port Paws flyer with the strange coordinates on the back. But the centerpiece, the part she knew people would remember, was a clip she'd taken the night Ash saved Frank. Frank, blood on his face, clutching the pup in the rain. Ash growling, defiant, standing over him. Mira had recorded it in a panic. Now it played like a revelation. She took a breath and hit upload. By mid-afternoon, the video had reached over 5,000 views, then 10, then 50. Comments poured in. Sympathy, shock, some skepticism, but more voices than Mira expected were asking the same question. What's really going on at Port Paws? She sat beside Frank on the front steps of the garage, phone buzzing constantly in her hand. Cole lay at their feet, and Ash dozed nearby in the sun, finally breathing evenly again. "It's spreading," she said quietly. Frank glanced at her. "They'll say it's fake." "Some already are, but others are digging. There's a Reddit thread, and one guy in Oregon says his sister's dog disappeared after being rescued by a charity that used the same exact form." Frank's brow furrowed. She showed him the screen. It was a side-by-side image. Port Paws paperwork next to one labeled Sunrise Animal Collective, San Luis Obispo. The logos were different, but the template was identical. Same layout, same fields, even the same typo in the word vaccination. "They're part of a network," Mira whispered. "This goes beyond Eldermere." Frank took the phone, stared at it for a long time, then said, "It won't matter if no one inside speaks up." "They will. They just need to know they're not alone." That evening, Mira sat down in Ellie's living room and recorded another video. This time, she spoke directly into the lens. "My name is Mira Ortega. I'm 17. I volunteered at Port Paws for 3 weeks. What I saw wasn't a rescue. It was a machine. And I believe it's part of something bigger." She didn't cry, her voice didn't shake. She told the story from the beginning, how she found Ash and Cole with Frank, how they uncovered missing records, and how the facility never let her near certain doors. She spoke of Gina, of Haskins, of the tag left behind in the garage. Then, with a click, she uploaded again. Frank watched her from the hallway, one hand resting on the frame. His eyes were unreadable, but his chest rose and fell like he was bracing for a wave that hadn't hit yet. "You're putting a target on your back," he said. "I already had one," Mira replied. By midnight, the second video had gone viral. News stations reached out, blogs picked it up. A well-known YouTuber with 1 million subscribers re-uploaded the clip with a voiceover. If even half of this is true, we need answers. But not all reactions were supportive. Frank's name trended for all the wrong reasons. Old photos from the Coast Guard archives surfaced, rumors about his past, his grief, accusations that he had snapped, that he was mentally unfit, that Mira had been manipulated. And in the middle of it, a headline from the Eldermere Gazette dropped like an anchor. "Local veteran involved in vigilante claims against animal shelter." The byline, "Calvin Haskins." Frank sat in silence as he read it. The words weren't surprising. The venom was. He dropped the paper onto the workbench. "He's trying to bury us with words." Mira looked at him, then said, "Then we bury him with truth." At dawn, Ellie brought in an envelope. "It was taped to my front gate," she said, handing it to Frank. Inside were 3 photos, printed, not digital. Each showed a different puppy, all injured, all tagged with Port Paws collars, and on the back of each one, the same word had been written by hand: liar. Frank looked up. "He's escalating." Ellie nodded. "Then so must we." The courthouse in Eldermere stood like a solemn stone witness, its steps slick with morning dew and decades of unspoken truths. Its weathered facade had seen everything from petty theft to land disputes. But today, for the first time in recent memory, the building was surrounded not by silence, but by voices. Dozens of them. Some holding signs, some simply holding breath. Frank stood at the bottom of the steps, adjusting the collar of the only jacket he owned that didn't smell of sawdust or oil. He hadn't been in a courtroom in over 20 years. Not since the inquest into Daniel's death, where his grief was filed, recorded, and quietly dismissed. But today was different. Today, he wasn't standing trial. He was standing witness. Beside him, Mira adjusted her hoodie, eyes locked ahead, jaw clenched in defiance. She wore no makeup, no mask, just her truth. Ash and Cole stayed home with Ellie, safe for once. Across the crowd, Greta Lane stood with folded arms and a faint nod of approval. Monica Reyes was there too, her silver-streaked hair tied back in a tight bun, eyes scanning the press with the cold precision of a woman who had waited too long to be believed. Reporters were already swarming the steps, microphones pointed like weapons. "Mr. Holloway, do you believe Port Paws was part of a national ring? Did you fabricate the story for online fame? Is it true you were dishonorably discharged from the Coast Guard?" Frank didn't answer. He walked past them, one hand gently guiding Mira forward. Inside, the courtroom was warmer than expected, but no less heavy. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, and the ceiling fan rotated lazily, as if unconcerned with the gravity of what was about to unfold. On the bench sat Judge Carolina Miles, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled into a crown braid and eyes that missed nothing. Her gavel rested lightly on a stack of legal pads. The defendants, Calvin Haskins, Gina Caraway, and two unnamed Port Paws associates, sat in identical charcoal suits behind a long table. Haskins looked every bit the politician. Clean-shaven, composed, only his eyes betraying that wolfish sharpness. Gina, by contrast, wore her exhaustion like a second skin, shoulders rigid, lips pressed into a line of contempt. The prosecution began by laying out the network: adoption fraud, undocumented animal transport across state lines, use of unlicensed sedatives, and obstruction of investigations. Photos, financial trails, witness reports, including Mira's footage. Then Frank was called. He stepped to the stand slowly, his limp more visible than usual. Mira watched from the front row, fingers clenched around her knee. Frank's voice didn't falter. He told them about the storm, about Daniel, about Rex, then about Ash and Cole, found hanging at the pier like forgotten trash. He spoke of Monica, of Ellie, of Mira. He spoke of the night someone broke into the garage and hurt a pup not old enough to fight back. The courtroom was silent. Then the defense cross-examined, attacking his past. "Mr. Holloway, how many times did you file complaints in the last 20 years? Would you consider yourself emotionally stable? Have you, at any point, fabricated details for the sake of attention or legacy?" Frank answered with clarity, not anger. "I'm not a hero. I'm a man who buried a son, and I'm tired of watching the world turn away from pain just because it wears fur." When Mira was called, she walked with steady steps. She didn't look at the defendants, not even once. She spoke about her time inside Port Paws, about the blank tags, the locked doors, the tracking of undocumented animals. She showed the court her phone, archived footage, messages, deleted files she'd recovered with help from online supporters. Then she paused, her breath catching. "And I need to speak about someone else," she said. The judge nodded. Mira looked to the side of the room where a young man sat with shackles around his wrists and exhaustion in his eyes. Connor Ortega, her brother. Once strong and broad-shouldered, he now looked hollowed out, the weight of months in custody carved into his posture. He didn't meet her gaze. "He used to be part of them," Mira said. "Not the worst of them, but enough. He saw what they did. He stayed silent. But he also sent me this." She handed a printed photo to the bailiff, an old, grainy image of a back room at Port Paws. Inside, cages. Not kennels. Cages too small, too dark, filled with dogs that were never meant to be seen. The judge raised her brow. Where did he get this? He took it before he left, before they forced him out. He was going to send it anonymously, but didn't know how. Connor finally looked up. Mira met his eyes, and after a long silence she said, "I forgive him. Not because he deserves it, but because I don't want to carry the weight he dropped." The courtroom murmured. Frank's eyes glistened. By the end of the day, the judge didn't render a full verdict. That would come after deliberation. But she granted a motion for continued investigation into Port Paws' finances and sealed the facility until further notice. The press exploded with the headline, "Court shutters Port Paws facility pending abuse investigation." But it wasn't just that. People started talking, donors pulled out, city officials scrambled, online forums buzzed with reports of other rescues with similar operations, connected through a silent, rotting thread. That night, back at Ellie's, Mira sat on the porch swing, phone in hand, watching comments roll in. Some hopeful, some hateful, but she had stopped checking for approval. Inside, Frank rested in the armchair, Ash curled across his feet. Cole snored softly on the rug. "They'll come for us harder now," Mira said. Frank replied without opening his eyes. Let them. We've already bled. Now we bark. Morning in Eldermere carried a new sound, one unfamiliar but welcome. It was not the cry of sirens or the rustle of suspicion, but the scrape of tools, the echo of laughter, and the low murmur of dogs stretching toward the sun. The garage, once a space of shadows and silence, now bloomed with a life Frank had never expected to see again. He stood just outside the wide-open bay doors, hands on his hips, watching as two teens, Junie Bell and Zeke Hammond, Mira's faithful friends, hauled in freshly painted wooden crates stamped with paw prints and hearts. The crates would serve as temporary bedding for the first round of rescued animals arriving later that week. The transformation of the garage had taken months. After the trial and the slow dismantling of Port Paw's facade, donations had poured in. Many anonymous, others from as far away as Michigan and Oregon, where Mira's videos had found kindred hearts. Volunteers came in waves, local carpenters, retirees, even a small class of middle schoolers who painted murals of dogs and stars along the concrete walls. But the vision, the anchor of it all, belonged to Mira. The girl who once rode her squeaky bike past Frank's gate now held clipboards and organized cleaning rotations like a general with purpose. She still wore her hoodie, but now it had the shelter's logo printed on the back. The new harbor, haven for the left behind. Inside, Ellie knelt near one of the lower kennels, checking the bedding. Her salt and pepper hair was tied into a practical bun, and her sleeves were rolled past her elbows. Ash padded beside her, tail wagging with a practiced ease, while Cole trotted ahead, head held high like a proud sentry. They had grown in the months since the courtroom echo had faded. Ash had filled out, his frame still lean but strong, his fur gleaming golden gray in the sunlight. His limp was slight now, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. Cole, heavier and broader, had developed a stoic calm, never far from Ash, but always scanning, always present. What no one could have predicted was their effect on people. It began the day a boy named Emmett, age 8, with nonverbal autism, visited the garage with his foster mother. He'd curled up beside Ash without a sound, his face pressed against the dog's chest. Ash had stayed still, not even blinking, his breathing slow and steady until the boy matched it. Then, softly, a whisper, Emmett spoke one word, dog. It was enough. From then on, the new harbor received requests, schools, therapy centers, parents desperate for connection, and Ash and Cole, brothers born of pain, became something new. They became healers. One morning, Mira found Frank at the back of the garage, hammering in a final nail on a plaque. She paused, tilting her head. Straight? He asked without turning. Crooked as your posture, she said, grinning. He chuckled and stepped aside. The plaque gleamed in the early light. In memory of Daniel Halloway and Rex. For all who ran toward the sea? Mira swallowed. You think he'd be proud? Frank didn't answer immediately. He just looked at the wall, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. He'd have hated the name, he muttered. Would have asked for something cooler. Rescue Base Delta or something equally ridiculous. Mira smiled. But yes, Frank added, I think he would have been proud. Of you most of all. That weekend, a new volunteer arrived. A quiet woman in her early 30s, Sarah Dean, with long, frizzy red hair tied back and thin spectacles that always slid down her nose. She wore denim overalls and soft shoes, and she rarely spoke unless spoken to. But her hands were gentle, especially with frightened dogs. She had once worked for a similar organization in another city, she said, but left after realizing what happened to the dogs who never got adopted. She didn't elaborate. Frank didn't ask, but when she met Ash and Cole, she cried. Not loudly, just a slow, wet smile and silent tears that fell onto Cole's back as she crouched to hold him. He licked her hand once, then settled beside her. They're not just survivors, she whispered. They're lighthouses. By the end of the month, the garage's front wall had been replaced with floor-to-ceiling windows. Natural light poured in across the kennels and the reading nook where children sat with volunteers, books in hand, dogs resting beside them like guardians of story time. Ash and Cole took turns lying by the little ones, ears perked, tails swaying slowly. Calm, safe, sacred. One afternoon, Mira stood at the window, watching a girl in a wheelchair toss a ball toward Cole. It bounced once. Cole fetched it, and returned like it was the most important job in the world. She turned to Frank. "We did it." Frank shook his head. "You did it." She nudged him. "You bled for it." He grunted. "That's true." They both laughed. Then the doorbell chimed, a soft sound that marked a new chapter, not an end. Outside stood a young man with military posture, a duffel bag over his shoulder, and a nervous smile on his face. "I heard you help dogs," he said, "but I was wondering if maybe you help people too?" Frank stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Sometimes, son. Sometimes the dogs help us." And Ash, standing behind Frank, barked once, bright, steady, and full of light. It was late, long past the hour when most of Eldermere had gone quiet. The town folded into the hush that followed the breath of the ocean. Outside the garage now shelter, a single porch light glowed, a soft yellow halo cast over the doorway, buzzing faintly against the cool spring air. Underneath it stood Frank Halloway, holding something wrapped in linen, something that had waited too long to be seen. He stepped slowly into the main room, where Ash and Cole lay curled on their shared cushion near the wall-length windows. Both lifted their heads, blinking in the dim light. Mira was asleep on the couch, an open notebook sprawled beside her, its pages filled with outlines, donor notes, and a sketch of the garden they were planning behind the building. Frank didn't wake her. Instead, he crossed the room to the newly built wall, the one they had left bare on purpose, not for lack of money or paint, but because Frank had said he wasn't done yet. Now he was. With careful hands, he unwrapped the linen and lifted the canvas, its frame aged and familiar. He had painted it months ago, before the trial, before the storm, back when Ash was still limping, and Frank could barely speak Daniel's name without his voice cracking, but he had never hung it, until now. The painting showed a ship at sea, sails full, cutting across a silver horizon. On deck stood a boy, Daniel, mid-laugh, one hand shielding his eyes from the sun. Beside him were two dogs, Ash and Cole, older than they were in real life, but unmistakably them, their ears perked, eyes bright, fur stirred by wind that didn't exist. Behind them, the ocean shimmered with impossible light. Frank stepped back and looked at it. He hadn't added himself to the picture, not because he didn't belong, but because finally, he didn't need to be in it to feel part of it. He exhaled, long and slow, then he smiled. It was a small thing, crooked, tired, but it stayed. Earlier that day, he'd taken Ash and Cole for a walk through the town square. They wore their new vests, therapy dog in training stitched in bold red letters, and trotted proudly at his side. Passers-by waved, some even clapped. One old man tipped his hat and said, "Good work, Captain," though Frank hadn't worn a uniform in 20 years. They stopped by the old coffee shop, now under new ownership. The barista, a young woman named Lena, tall and bright-eyed with a septum ring and paint-splattered sneakers, refused to take his money. "You've done more for this town than half the council," she said, placing a cup in his hand. "Besides, they love your dogs, and my grandma won't shut up about you." He chuckled. "Your grandma have a name?" "Edith Boone." Frank nearly dropped the cup. "The Edith Boone?" "Yep, that's her watercolor of the lighthouse behind the counter." Frank blinked. "She once beat me in a town art contest. I still think she cheated." Lena grinned. "She said the same about you." Back at the garage, Mira had spent most of the afternoon helping a new family settle in with a rescued golden retriever named Maple, a nervous girl with matted fur and eyes that had seen more than they should. The parents, Devin and Ray, were in their late 30s, both social workers, soft-spoken and warm. Their son, Theo, had survived a house fire 6 months earlier and hadn't spoken since, until Maple sat beside him. He reached out, touched her head, and whispered, "Safe." Frank had watched from a distance. When Mira came over later, cheeks flushed, eyes glowing, she said, "I think this place really works." Frank nodded. "It does now." The sky turned dark as he sat in the garage alone. The porch light behind him buzzed like a memory trying to whisper. He reached for his sketch pad and began a new drawing. Not a full painting, just a sketch. Quick strokes. A child's hand holding a leash. Two tails swaying in unison. The outline of a lighthouse in the distance. He didn't notice Mira wake up. She crossed the room silently, barefoot, yawning. When she saw the painting on the wall, she stopped. "You hung it?" He nodded. Felt right. She stepped beside him. You okay? I think I might be. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the canvas. You know, Mira said, there's still a lot of work to do. I know, she smiled. You up for it? Frank tilted his head toward Ash and Cole, now snoring in perfect synchrony. They seem to think I am. Later that night, Frank stepped outside and leaned against the doorway beneath the yellow light. The sea air smelled of salt and grass, distant barbecues, and coming spring. In the distance, the lighthouse blinked once, twice, then again, steady, faithful. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded paper. Not much on it, just a few lines. Dear Daniel, today I finished your painting. I think it's good. Not perfect, but real. The dogs, Ash and Cole, they saved me. Mira did too. She reminded me how to fight, but more than that, how to let go. I miss you. I always will. But I think I'm done looking back and only seeing pain. Now when I close my eyes, I see you with them. On the deck, wind in your hair, barking at gulls. I hope that's where you are. Somewhere light touches everything. Love, Dad. He didn't mail it. Didn't need to. He folded it again, tucked it into his chest pocket, and looked up at the stars. Then, for the first time in over 2 decades, Frank Holloway smiled and meant it. What this story teaches us: sometimes miracles don't come with thunder or flashes of light. Sometimes they come quietly, like a trembling puppy left for dead, or an old man who thought he'd buried every reason to hope. This story is about more than a garage, a trial, or 2 rescued dogs. It's about redemption, about the way God can work through the most broken pieces of our lives and turn them into shelter for others. Frank didn't plan to be a hero. Mira didn't set out to change lives. And yet, by choosing love over fear, they became part of something bigger than themselves. In a world that often feels cold, angry, and divided, this story reminds us that healing is still possible, kindness still matters, and that even the smallest act of compassion, like stopping for a wounded animal, can echo farther than we imagine. Maybe you're carrying your own silence, your own sorrow. Maybe you're waiting on a miracle that feels long overdue. If so, take heart. Sometimes God answers not with a shout, but with a whisper. Not with a storm, but with a soft bark in the dark. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to remember what grace looks like. Leave a comment, let us know your thoughts or your own story. Subscribe to follow more stories that speak to the heart. And may God bless you, protect you, and remind you, you are never forgotten.